Welcome everybody to the webinar about conservation in a commercial farming context. ILCN and ELCN encourage and promote private land conservation. Well, very many private landowners happen to be farmers. According to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, 38% of the world's land area is used agriculturally. 49 million square kilometers in all. That's 5 times the size of Canada or the USA or China. 2/3 of this is pasture. A quarter is arable, and the rest is what the FAO calls permanent crops, vineyards, orchards, rubber and coffee plantations, and so on. So we have here a vast opportunity and challenge for private land conservation. But in how many scientific descriptions of biodiversity loss, species decline, and habitat destruction is agriculture accused of being one of the main causes? How often do ecologists point the finger at intensification of farming, at clearing of wild nature to create more productive land, at pollution by fertilizers and pesticides? How common are land use policy debates where farmers' associations and conservation NGOs are not sitting on opposite sides of the table? So are those who produce food and those who protect nature doomed to be enemies, utter opposites, as the webinar title says? Tonight's 3 speakers are going to show you that it's not so black and white. As we heard in the ILCN webinar on April the 29th, 60% of all covenants, easements, to protect nature forever, which exist now in New Zealand, are on farm properties. That's already an indication. Get ready to hear a lot more. In order of speaking, we have Martin Lyons from the Nature Friendly Farming Network, Great Britain, Ilana Moyer from the Colorado Westland Trust, USA, and James Ryan from the New Zealand Farm Environment Trust. Martin and James are from the farming sector, and Ilana is from a land trust NGO working for conservation. Each is from a different continent, so we may expect a study in contrasts. But will you be able to spot the similarities, the common ground? Martin, the floor is yours. Okay, technology is with us.
Is that working?
Yes, perfectly.
Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So my name is Martin Lyons. I'm an arable farmer in Cambridgeshire in the United Kingdom. I'm a 3rd generation farmer on a family farm of 165 hectares. We also rent and contract farm additional land. Taking the operation, we cover over 500 hectares. Since coming back from university 20 years ago, my concentration is about joining up our environmental improvements and our farming business. We mainly grow wheat, barley, oilseed, rape and beans, and join up other habitats across our farm landscape. Next slide, please. Our farming has changed a lot in the last 80 years. So our family farm were originally horses and steam engines, and then along came the tractors. Post Second World War, the nation was hungry and the government incentivized farmers to produce more food. Much of our subsidy system that the farmers receive encouraged the loss of biodiversity and habitat. My parents and grandparents were paid and encouraged to remove hedgerows, fill ditches in, and farm to the edge of the fields to get the maximum food production as possible. And this continues up to this day with the subsidy system we're in, but that may be changing. On many farms, though, we recognise the loss that's happened on our landscape when we're trying to change this. Next slide, please. So on our farm, we use lots of modern technology on our farming operation, and we use lots of GPS and targeted inputs. So the image on the left-hand side shows the scans of the field to identify the different soil types within a field. And the centre of that image shows you where we can place different seed rates across the field to identify the productivity levels of the fields. And to the very left is the nutrient placement we can place within small areas of the field, so we reduce our environmental impact we have within the farming operation. The two images on the right-hand side are my yield monitors from my combine. Green is good yield and usually good profit. Red is poor yield and equals usually a loss. Many of the red areas stay in the same place every year, regardless of my farming management. So for me, it recognises that we can take away some of the farmed area and make our businesses more profitable and more productive. Next slide, please. So the image you see on the right-hand side, we see some little brown areas taken out on the side of the fields. So removing overlaps of machinery, inputs, particularly near watercourses and habitat areas, we reduce our impact to our landscape, reduce the costs and inputs to our landscape, and actually increase the productivity of my farming. So I reduce my costs and inputs by approximately 12% and see a 15% yield increase by taking away those less productive areas out of our farmed landscape. We also can widen the nature's barrier around environmental features around the outside of the field, and to do that across the landscape. And you can see that within both images as wider gaps and the lighter green stripes. Next slide, please. It's not just about arable farming. Many livestock farmers are doing similar practices across the UK. So the image I have on the right-hand side is Neil Heseltine, an upland sheep farmer. 10 years ago, he was spending 90 hours a week chasing his sheep around and only earning £400 a year. He soon recognised this was unsustainable. So by reducing his sheep numbers back down to the levels they were 100 years ago, he actually spends 40 hours a week now chasing his sheep, but most of the time it's just watching. He's now making between £14,000 and £20,000 with a fewer amount of sheep. And instead of having to buy inputs in and artificial food and fertilisers to up his productivity of his landscape, the reduced livestock manages the landscape better. He has sheds now available and can convert those to holiday lets to have a secondary income. He also has introduced native breed cattle to eat the grasses the sheep won't eat, and his landscape is becoming more productive with biodiversity. He's seeing many wild flowers coming back into the landscape. My slides have just disappeared. Oh, thank you. And many other farmers are now recognising to use native cattle breeds in the right place, in the right landscape. And they're far more productive in using those breeds and using less inputs of fertilisers, pesticides and other products. Next slide, please. Many nature-friendly farmers are delivering habitats and connectivity right across the landscape, re-establishing many of the ponds that have been lost and filled in. One of the many precious resources nature needs is a water resource. Bottom right is one of the hedgerows that have been re-established. We can get some government grants to re-establish those and leave natural barriers around alongside where that's less productive land. The image along the bottom is a public right-of-way across a farm. We can deliver those biodiversity strips and habitats to keep the public out of our production areas and just give that buffer zone. Bottom right is another one where we protect watercourses. As an arable farmer, I don't want any products entering into the watercourse and depleting those areas. so we can buffer that. And what we also deliver right across the landscape is pollinator and habitat resource. What we're finding by having the additional pollinator resource across the landscape for the whole year, we're seeing typical yield increases between 5 and 20% near flowering crops. And we're able to reduce the use of artificial products, and we've taken away insecticides because we have a more beneficial predatory insects living in our landscape, able to have better pest control. And the image in the centre is just many of the different species that we're welcoming back onto the farm landscape. Next image, please. So as farmers, we're told much about how we produce more crops and better management for livestock. Many farmers need better understanding of our natural asset. The more we can help and support that and have the knowledge of the wildlife we have on farmland, the better we can manage it. So on our farm, we have many bird species we're improving. Nationally, we see headlines of loss of species by 50 or 90+%. And on many farms now, we're reversing those declines. So the top left, the lapwings are coming back. And the next one was the yellowhammers, the English or the grey partridge. Numbers, there were 1 or 2 pairs across the whole farm 10 years ago, and now 1 or 2 pairs per field we have. And for my own pleasure, it's the barn owl, the right-hand images. We put a number of nest boxes up across the landscape, and we get to interact with those and see the numbers increase. Next image, please. Much of our landscape is core cost to our business, and it costs us money to maintain and improve. In the UK, we can get government grants at the moment to improve various aspects that have been declining. So the images on the left-hand side of livestock fencing, and traditionally known as, can be called environmental protection fencing. If we can protect watercourses and environmental features, we can get public support for that. The centre images are hedgerows that have been re-established and margins beside, and the right-hand images are the watercourses we're protecting with buffers. As we transition out of the UK transitions out of Europe the end of this year, we're going to transition into a new kind of public support for farming, and it'll be called public money for public goods. And it'll be targeting delivering environmental features to enhance the landscape for future productivity of our food. Next image, please. So as I said at the end, I'm the UK chair of the Nature Friendly Farming Network, a network that was set up just over 3 years ago. Why, you may ask, a new network of farmers? Independent research done 5 years ago showed that it would be good support to have a UK voice of this kind of farming, of how we join up our wildlife and our production and explain it to policymakers and to public. We can be highly effective in having a strong voice with those policymakers and governments, and how farming can be supported by the public. And if we do nothing, we risk losing political traction and having that positive change to more sustainable and agroecological farming system. And together, working together across the UK, we can teach each other what works best for farmers. The network has a membership of farmers, members of the public and organisations. We already have over 100 organisations supporting farmers and understanding the landscape they manage. Many of these organisations have different opinions of farmers. We choose not to, we don't have to believe in everything they say, and we don't have to go along with all what the organisations stand for, but we must find common ground and work on targets to work together. Next slide, please. So we hope by bringing farmers together across the UK, we're explaining to public how their food is produced, how the landscape can be managed for better, explaining to policymakers and governments why farming can be supported in positive ways. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Martin. That was really good, and you've already attracted a couple of questions I can see on the question and answer function. But we'll take those after the other two have presented their presentation. So I now give the floor to Ilana.
Hello, thank you for having me. Nice to be connecting with everyone via Zoom. I am Ilana Moyer. I'm based in Western Colorado, so center west of the US, and I work for Colorado West Land Trust. The Land Trust is a nonprofit and NGO that focuses on farm and ranch land and wildlife conservation. We were founded in 1980 by a group of farmers, actually, and they wanted to see farmland preserved and protected for the long term. And since then, we've grown to serve a much larger region in our state, and we were founded as one of the first agricultural land trusts in the United States. Us and American Farmland Trust, I believe, were founded in the same year. So we have a long history of working with farmers and ranchers, and I'm excited to share a little more about our work. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to share two case studies in terms of what we have done for conservation and how those conservation of farms and ranches has contributed to wildlife habitat as well. So the first case study is looking at an area that we call Glade Park. It's a higher elevation, high desert landscape that we work in. Very little irrigated fields, and it's predominantly ranch landscape. And in our area, beef is the #1 agricultural export. So ranching has a very high importance economically and to our local economy. And the ranchers that we work with in this landscape have a very long-term history with the landscape, with the community, with the economy. A lot of them, their grandparents may have homesteaded in the area, so there's a really long history and love of the landscape and connection there. So we have the ranchers on one side, and then as part of this landscape, there is the Gunnison sage grouse, which you can see in the lower photo. And the Gunnison sage grouse is not very common bird. It's located in the middle of our state is its base population, and the bird has 5 satellite populations, and the largest satellite population is in our landscape. So right now we're looking at both of these kind of interests coming together. Next slide. And the landscape that we're working in, this is what it looks like. It's a lot of mixture of sagebrush, which is that kind of gray color, a real mosaic of sagebrush, desert, riparian swales that run through the landscape, exposed rock, and juniper and pinyon, so really dry, arid landscape. And the sage grouse, the Gunnison sage grouse, especially loves that mosaic. So they hide out in the bushes, they come out and feed in some of these more riparian wetland areas. And so there's what we look at is how can we get ranchers and people that own part of this landscape to care about the bird and protecting the bird. Next slide. And there's a long history of working with the ranchers. We've been working with this group of landowners for 25, almost 30 years in this context. And the ranchers, their motivation to see the birds' habitat conserved is has many layers. So one, they want to produce better forage and grass for their cattle. There's a lot of land management practices that actually, if it's better for the bird, it's also better for the cattle. And so those go hand in hand. They wanted to see, especially over the first kind of 15 years that we were working with them, they wanted to see the threat of the Gunnison sage grouse being listed as a threatened or endangered species removed. They did not want the bird to be listed because that would come with a whole set of guidelines from the federal level in terms of how they manage their properties. They want to create better habitat for multiple types of wildlife, and part of that is a lot of ranchers work with hunting on their properties, and they wanted to see habitat in general improved. And then there's just the pride in existence of the bird in this landscape. The ranchers take a lot of pride in the fact that rare bird exists in their own backyards, so to speak. Next slide. And the landscape that we're working in is, and I apologize, the colors are a little off here, but the gray is private lands, and the brown, the dark brown and the pale brown, the tan color, are public lands. So there's a big diversity in land ownership in this area. Next slide. And what we have conserved are the red properties. So the red and the green are conserved. So it's a significant amount of the private land has been conserved as part of this landscape. Next slide. And overlapping that is the yellow, and the yellow is the Gunnison sage grouse habitat. So over 37 years of work in this landscape, we've worked with 30 ranching families through 65 transactions, and actually conserved over just under 75% of the habitat for the bird on this landscape. And what that means to the ranchers, next slide please. What that means to the ranchers is that they have an increased quality and quantity of forage for the cattle. So they have not only been working on conserving their land, but also there's been a plethora of other activities that they can participate in, a lot similar to what Martin was talking about in terms of just land management. And so this has been in concert with conservation, with land conservation. There's been funding provided to landowners for conservation. That has come from both the federal and the state level, as well as a number of foundations have put money into paying landowners to conserve their properties. They're also in the United States, and specifically in the state of Colorado, there are very generous tax benefits associated with conserving your ground. So there's a tax deduction at the federal level, but at the state level, there's a tax credit. And I'm going to speak just a tiny bit about it because it's unique. There are a handful of states in the United States that offer a tax credit to landowners for conserving their property. When they conserve their property, the tax credit is transferable, which means they can use the tax credit themselves, or they can sell it to a third party. And that has been key in promoting conservation in Colorado, because a lot of landowners are cash poor, land rich. And so enabling them to sell some development rights or do a conservation easement allows them to then generate cash through selling their tax credits. And so they are able to reinvest that in their land. So I just wanted to touch on that because it's a little unique for our landscape. So and they also have better quality wildlife habitat, leading to better hunting and guiding opportunities. So there are hunting and guiding happening, and then a decrease in estate taxes, and that's a state level benefit. And then, so that's our first case study. I want to talk about ranching. It's a very unique thing to bring ranchers together to conserve wildlife habitat. The other one I want to talk about is what we call our Fruitlands Forever initiative. Next slide. So next slide, please. Should be a sunset slide. So in the context of farming in Western Colorado, as I mentioned, we're in high desert, so everything depends on irrigated agricultural land. And this is a picture of that. You can see the desert in the background, and then the beautiful irrigated fields in the foreground. In our part of Colorado, we produce peaches, grapes, apples, a lot of fruit. It provides over 90% of the fruit in Colorado is grown in a very small, compact area. And these farms all contain, they have to have water rights to serve those agricultural fields. And so the water rights are critical to keeping agricultural landscapes going. They're also critical to the tailwater, so the water that runs off the field at the end is very important for wetlands and wetlands, enhancing wetlands as well. These properties also buffer federal lands, and the major river corridors flow right through the center of this farming landscape. And so buffering the waterways from development in the future helps decrease runoff into the waterways, and just the development that disrupts riparian habitat, bird habitat, and fish habitat. Next slide, please. And all these lands are very highly developable. They're flat, they're beautiful, they have water, so there's a lot of threat to developing these. So what is in it for the farmers? Why would they want to conserve their property and work on habitat projects? They are really looking at how do they ensure the availability of farmland for the next generation. So as you can see, we have many farmers that we work with are multi-generation farming families. A lot of them want to expand their operations, so if they can keep their kids on, if their kids can come back from college and keep farming, they need to expand the operation to pay for that. They want to protect their water rights. Water is very, very important in the West, and being able to conserve those water rights, keep the water rights with the property is important to them. And the long-term economic viability of the farming industry. So we want to see the farming industry continue. You need a really sustainable land base to support a long-term farming industry, which could be a whole other presentation. Next slide, please. And so this is a good example of the river. This is the Colorado River running right through the landscape. In the background, you can see a lot of those farm fields, and then you can see on either side are really the riparian habitat that's great for birds and mammals. So there's financial benefits to the local economy in keeping the farming going. The farming exports, there's a lot of local tourism that's driven by the existence of these farms. So a lot of people come from cities, Denver, Salt Lake City, and want to experience wine country. They want to go peach picking. And they're not necessarily depending on the products themselves, but the landscape. They want to come and enjoy the landscape as well. In addition, we want to see the riparian areas conserved. We want to see the water rights stay in Colorado and not go downstream. As I mentioned, the return flows from irrigating the fields helps boost the water in the Colorado River. And this specific section of river is important for what's designated as the critical reach of the Colorado River. That's important for fish habitat and some endangered species of fish. So we always want to have enough water in the river for this section. And then the riparian habitat along the river is equally important for the fish habitat. Next slide, please. So when we're working with farmers, the benefits to them are very important. As I mentioned, they want that stable land base conserved for the next generation. We want to make sure that if they are investing in a farm and in a fruit farm where you don't see your final payout maybe for the first 5 years, there's no payment, and your trees live for 30 years, produce for 30 years. So they have really long time horizons when they're looking at economic viability. So they want to make sure that if they're investing in a landscape, land will be available for farming over the long term. The funded conservation easements and purchased conservation easements, similar to what I spoke about earlier, we have great funding in the state to help conserve these properties. And also the support of Colorado State University Extension Services, which helps support more of the farming practices associated with the properties. The landowners have the ability, when they do a conservation easement, a lot of them take that funding and then reinvest it into expanding their operations, and the water rights stay intact. So we make sure that the water stays in Colorado, the tailwater serves the Colorado River, and we don't just see that all float downstream. Next slide. So I think both of these examples, it's very extremely different landscapes that we're looking at. But in both of these examples, landowners have a really great attachment to their land and a vested interest in seeing it its continued productivity. So they want to make sure that the land is here for the long term, and that their kids, their grandkids can keep farming or ranching the properties. Wildlife habitat may not be the highest priority when they're looking at what they do with their land, but it is a goal of the land trust that can be met through conservation. And a lot of landowners, once they enter into conservation agreements and they start seeing how both conservation agreements combined with land management activities can boost their productivity in terms of livestock production or water retention on their properties, stuff like that, the wildlife habitat component grows in importance in their eyes. And I think the goal for us is finding the nexus of conservation goals, which may be driven more by an NGO, and the economic goals. And somewhere in there is a lasting and really impactful conservation can take place, where you have all the parties meeting somewhere in the middle of where their goals come together. Next slide, please. So thank you, I appreciate it. That's my contact information there, and I'm happy to chat more afterwards.
Right. Thank you, Ilana. That was very interesting. And those transferable tax credits for development rights. It's really interesting financial engineering. I wonder how replicable that would be in other countries around the world. Something to think about. We now go to the opposite side of the world, the Antipodes. James, the floor is yours.
So my name's James Ryan. I manage the New Zealand Farm Environment Trust. It's a charity set up to promote sustainable farming. Our main activity is running an awards program called the Balanced Farm Environment Awards. Through the awards, we highlight individual examples of farming excellence, and we use those stories, those farming characters to involved in good practice to inspire others with their farming and growing journey. The next slide, please. I've just got just to set the context a little bit. So up until recently, tourism was vying with farming as being our most important sector. I think it's significant to note that subsidies were removed in New Zealand in the 1980s. So we've been operating without any form of public payments for our farmers for about 30 or 40 years. And no one is advocating for that they be returned. So that means that farmers' investment in the environment, protection of nature, biodiversity enhancements are undertaken at the farmer's own expense. And despite this, despite the fact that we do face some environmental challenges as elsewhere, increasingly we see examples of the environment, biodiversity being incorporated alongside profitable farming. Next slide, please. Just got a bit of an example I'd like to talk through. Perhaps if you could start the video, let's see if that works, and I'll mention Ross and Eleanor Weber, who are a fabulous couple. I think this is a great example of farmers involved in investing in biodiversity. Fire away.
This place is really special.
Grandfather bought the property. We farmed sheep, beef, deer. More recently, we've moved into any little remnant wetlands. We are protecting those. That's really where we're at. Yeah, just putting a fence up around them, keeping the deer out, keeping all the predators out, and the birds are doing their job. And that's where it's really at. You could have fired a shot through here and not hit a tree 5 years ago. Yeah. The deer, the degradation in here was horrendous. And then all we've really done is put the fence around, a little bit of weed and pest control, which is always ongoing.
Totally enhanced the undergrowth.
Yeah,
once
and
you put your fence up.
You're getting this canopy coming through now.
And I think overwhelmed sometimes of actually what we have got on the farm. So I think we don't really appreciate it until maybe in the mornings you wake up and look out the window.
To that. So the Weber's farm just outside Auckland, which is New Zealand's largest city, and in that example, they've partly funded those biodiversity enhancements by selling off some land, and they've had some assistance from an organisation, the QE2 National Trust, who've provided advice in terms of planting and weeding and plant selection. And as you see, they're passionate because they've seen the native native forest and native birds returned to their property. It's had some native fish returned to a wetland on their property, and they've actually inspired others in their local community to take action. Next slide, please. And I like this quote from Ross, where he says, "I've never ever said I'm a sandal-wearing tree hugger, but when you plant a little tree and you watch it grow over 20 years, that's pretty special. It provides a lot of peace and serenity." But they have compromised some economic goals, but for them it's about that love of the land. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, New Zealand in context, we've in the last week we've hit a significant milestone and hit 5 million people, and they vie with a number of others, including about 30 million sheep, 10 million cattle, that's dairy and beef cattle. And I think it's worth noting, whether it was design or coincidence, we're very similar in land mass size to both Ilana and Martin in the UK. Next slide, just to give you a little bit of context of our key primary sector industries. So the dairy farming has grown quite significantly over the last 10 to 20 years, particularly on the back of increased demand from China, and also lamb and beef major exports. So I think it's probably just relevant to note that in terms of a so-called Western country, New Zealand is quite unusually reliant on our primary sector. Next slide, please. So just a very brief history lesson. So New Zealand is thought to be settled by our indigenous people, the Maori, in the 1300s, who came through the Pacific Islands. And then more recently, European settlers arrived en masse in the 1800s and 1900s, and went through a process of developing the land to partly resemble the European model of pastoral farming. And subsequently, a lot of our economic growth and prosperity has benefited from the extraction of natural resources. Come forward to the 1970s, 1980s, we were facing some quite significant economic challenges, and partly as a result of that, agricultural subsidies were removed from our farmers. And as I made the point earlier, no one is advocating that they be returned. And rightly or wrongly, New Zealand farmers feel that it's made them more responsive to global markets. We do have a very small domestic market, so we try to be good at exporting internationally, finding those markets that will take our largely farming products. And the theory behind that is partly that if food producers, if farmers are exposed to those market forces, if they are required to pay the full costs of their environmental impacts, and the theory is that it will drive them to make decisions which maximises profitability. Now, I'm not intending to suggest that it's a better or worse model than the US or the UK or elsewhere. It's simply, it is a different model. It's not to say that it hasn't come with its challenges. Finding high-value markets for New Zealand is an ongoing challenge, particularly in the new market with new countries looking at new tariffs and trade barriers. Perhaps to the next slide, please, Chandy. I just want to touch on some environmental impacts, and Anton gave us a bit of an overview of this at the start. Certainly over the last 10 or 20 years, as environmental awareness grows, not just within New Zealand, but globally, there's concerns that farming has impacts upon the environment, which also undermines trading reputation of some of our other industries, in particular tourism. And particular concerns around the impacts, for example, of farming upon water quality, greenhouse gases, and the loss of native biodiversity. And as a result of that, we now see more regulations, more policies, more red tape for farmers as they go about their business. And in fact, next week we're expecting some more water quality rules to be announced by the government. But interesting time politically, as calls go out for government to focus on supporting economic development. In the meantime, there's some new environmental rules coming. So next slide, please. I think Martin and Ilana have both touched on this point, and it's interesting to me that I don't think it matters if you're a farmer in New Zealand or elsewhere in the world. Farmers have this love of the land, and that's often their biggest driver for investing in environmental improvements. We certainly notice that new regulations and market forces, as global consumers demand their products to be produced sustainably, also drives more investment in good practice. But I think fundamentally it's the farmers' love of the land that drives some of their actions. Just in a New Zealand context, the Webbers, that short video we played highlighted some examples of good stewardship that they're involved in. Some other examples in a New Zealand context might include, of good stewardship that is, might include things like using water efficiently, using fertiliser efficiently, planting trees, taking stock out of waterways and fencing those off, and a whole range of other actions, some similar examples to those used by Martin and Ilana as well. Next slide, please. So we know, not just in a New Zealand context, but internationally, research suggests that it's the farmers' love of the land and their way of life which often drives them to invest in biodiversity protection, and often they will value that above making a profit. Well, making money is important, and it helps them to invest in the land. It's that way of life that they're often hugely passionate about. But the way in which we inspires them to take actions can sometimes differ. Just want to touch on another example, please, with the next slide. Just talk briefly about Kawaiwai, which in many ways reflects a short story of New Zealand, because this is now a dairy farm. Going back many decades, the land was deforested, the trees were cut down, the land was drained for farming, and here we are in 2020, and these characters are involved in trying to regenerate the land. The dairy farm of about 1,000 cattle. This is a reasonably unusual example, and they have pulled in some funding to help them construct a wetland, although they've set aside about a hectare or 2 acres. So they have taken some land out of production, and the reason they were successful in getting some matching funding was because it's being used as a trial or a pilot to inspire others, not just in their local area, which is the southern North Island and the Wairarapa, to take action. And a number of researchers have now taken an interest in applying some of those lessons elsewhere in the country. So in this particular example, it's been really effective at reducing pollution, nitrates off the local farming community, which otherwise would have flown into a nearby lake. I quite like their farming philosophy. Next slide, please. Which is quite simply to leave the farm in a better state than when they purchased it, while still being sustainable and profitable. So they really want to be seen as environmental champions for dairy farming in particular, and a role model to other farmers. Now I've got my final slide, thanks. So New Zealand's been on a bit of a journey. We now recognise we're too small to try and feed the world, but we've set out a vision to try and become the most sustainable producer of certain food products that will be in demand in key markets. Notice that increasingly there are examples of farmers taking actions to protect biodiversity on their property. And more generally, New Zealand is on this on a new pathway to try and incorporate environmental protection alongside profitable farming. So that's it from me. Very happy to take questions. I look forward to some robust discussion.
Right. Well, thanks, James. And a reminder to the audience, don't send questions through the chat function. Don't do that. And if you are going to say, if you want to go live, if you want to ask your question yourself, then please select the live option. And if you do not want to ask your question live, but prefer, for instance, for me to ask it on your behalf, then go for the anonymous function in the question and answer. Now, while we get the first question, we have quite a number of questions waiting, ready to be set to given to the panel. Here's a general question to the panel together. So we've seen and heard your 3 presentations, very different contexts. From no subsidies for farmers to tax credits and payments for ecosystem services. But there's one thing that's common to all 3. Farmers working for conservation and environment love their land, are proud of their local nature and wildlife. So how could that love and pride be stimulated among even more farmers? And how can civil society trusts and NGOs who also love nature meet these farmers and share that emotional motivation? So if each of you could briefly give your vision on that.
So I'll go first.
Yep, sure.
I think it's a public recognition for the food we produce as farmers and the landscape it comes from. And the farmers are really pleased when they get that recognition of how they care for their land. As we've heard, many farmers really do care for the landscape. And it's about that joined up approach. Many of the farmers don't understand, we haven't been taught the environmental side or the wildlife or the nature. When we went to universities and colleges, it was about the output of agricultural products. And we need to, in the UK, we need support and understanding as farmers of the environmental benefits and the other habitats and the wildlife. And we need to join those organisations together to work together for common goals.
Yeah, tagging on that, I think from the NGO's perspective, I could talk till I'm blue in the face, I could send out flyers, I could do presentations, but the best way to spread the information about conservation and the importance of conservation and also get people excited, especially farmers and ranchers excited about this work, is when they talk to a neighbor and their neighbor has done some of these practices or conserve their properties, and they can really speak in a language that they understand and it's a trusted source, and they can speak to their experiences and maybe how the conservation has benefited multiple aspects of their farming or ranching. And I think that is kind of our best way of spreading the word and getting other farmers and ranchers excited about these options.
Certainly from a New Zealand perspective, we recognise that consumers internationally are demanding food that's been produced in a way that's protected the environment. The great challenge for us all is, are they prepared to pay a premium for that? Particularly in light of increased concerns around food security. That's a really relevant one in the current context.
Right. Okay, and now we can take the first question. It's a live question. It's Britta Cooper. Please give us a moment while we unmute you.
Britta, you should now be able to unmute yourself. All right, I think Britta might not be there, so maybe we can move on to the next question.
Okay, that's an anonymous question, so I will ask it. It's to which extent could Martin Lyne's approach be implemented in small farms, agricultural holdings of only a few hectares? And I think they're referring to this GPS mapping and all that. Yeah.
It's understanding your landscape, whether you're on a small hectarage or a larger hectarage. And if it's smaller, you're more connected to the soil as a farmer. On a larger scale, operating from sitting in a tractor seat, you disconnect from the soil. So the same technology can be used, but some of that technology won't be needed because you're connecting with the soil in a different way.
Okay, good. And the next question is a live one. It's from Albertine Perdock. So we will unmute you.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I had a question for Martin as well. I was wondering if there's a Dutch equivalent of the Nature Friendly Farming Network.
I believe there's one or two organisations across Europe, but we're just starting to try and connect with different ones, particularly around the COP26 and some other national events that are happening, because we want to join nature-friendly farmers and various organisations together, because as we heard earlier, farmer-to-farmer learning and the passion we have for the landscape, our farming and nature needs to connect, not just in one country, but across the globe.
And would you know the names of them, of the?
Not written in front of me, but I have got connections with one or two.
Okay.
If you drop me a message afterwards, connect afterwards, I can help you out with that.
Yes, I will. Thanks.
Okay. The next question is also a live one. It's from Rowan Eisner. So Rowan, we're going to unmute you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. It was particularly aimed at Martin, talking about taking unproductive areas of the farm out of production, concentrating on the more productive areas. My PhD supervisor has done studies of that across the Australian landscape and looked at microclimate benefits that you get from it and increased ability to withstand climate change. And I also wondered about whether you'd found that and whether you'd also thought about any potential for carbon sequestration.
Yes, by delivering more hedgerows and other features. And we don't want to be farming bits we're losing money on as a business. If the crop price or the output price isn't there, why farm it? And let's do other things. So there's a lot of, we're looking quite hard about carbon capture and what other things we can do and how we can put more trees within the farmed landscape, which protects water resource, slows the evaporation, and actually bring more things in to do those. So yeah, there's lots of farmers are looking at a completely different way, particularly when we move away from an unfortunate subsidy system that we've been in to a newer system and lose that money for the per hectareage base, because it's disrupting our farming businesses to adapt to challenges ahead.
Thank you.
Okay, and now here's a question. I will ask this question because it was put by Sam Tarrant, but through the chat box quite early on in the session. So I'll ask it and the question is, and this is a general question to all three of you, I have the impression, how about a certification system to certify commercial farmers who deliver conservation so as to help create a market for the products? So go ahead, which of you wants to answer that one first?
I might start it. So there's been quite a bit of discussion about this in New Zealand context, and we've been looking enviously at what the Irish have done around Origin Green. A lot of our big agricultural companies have reservations about collaborating when they're competing against each other in different markets. So as one chairman of one of our big meat companies said to me, in Japan, Toyota and Mitsubishi don't collaborate, so why should we? Nevertheless, there is something being driven by government which will partly address that need for a common certification program. But at the moment, it's a lot of them are designed sector specific, so there might be something for particular dairy farmers or sheep and meat farmers, but not something across the farming industry. But there is more to talk about developing something.
Same thing, we are not same thing. We have some talk about various certifications. There's not one that's known nationally. So in our area, it'd be more of a local, you know, you'd promote, as a farmer rancher, you promote your own practices locally.
So UK, we have baseline standards already, but we're working with organisations to have a standard that recognises the biodiversity and habitat across the landscape, and engage that with public, because it's not about the supply chain. We need the public to recognise the differences of the food choices they have.
Okay, great. Next question is again is a question from Tillman, but again anonymous because he's had to leave, but he notified us of that. The question is, and that's one for Martin: are any of the UK agriculture payment schemes results-based, or are they only based on measure-based? And if it's results-based, what are the metrics? And I think you might probably be interested in what you just mentioned, this new farm system that the public payments for public goods.
So our current system, the older system, was paid you for a habitat delivery. As long as it was there, it didn't really matter what kind of standard it was, as long as you delivered. What we're moving into transition over the next 7 years to a newer system for the public money for public goods. Some will be about outcomes. Some will be about delivering above and beyond the target. Some will be an auction system, a reverse auction system, and some will be about just delivering. And we're going through a number of test and trials to work that out. So it's quite an exciting time, the next couple of years, of how that matrix works going forward for future farming.
Okay, the next question will be, again, is an anonymous question, and it's about what processes do farmers have in place to collect data regarding correlations between farm productivity, habitat restoration, and restoration of wildlife? So that's a question I think each of you might be interested in answering. So go ahead.
So in our landscape, it's not, most of the farmers are not collecting the data for wildlife habitat and wildlife increases or decreases. That's being done by conducted by the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which is a state agency that has been collecting wildlife data and deals with wildlife issues in the state. And so they actually collect that data on public lands, and then they have partnerships to collect that data on private lands as well. In terms of productivity, that is on the landowner side. Obviously, that's you know, not just the conservation initiatives is what they're looking at, but they're looking at drought and increased water and all kinds of other things go into that. But that comes out kind of in their bottom line at the end of the year, what they got off of the property and how productive it was.
We've got similarly, the NGOs are doing most of the recording, or in the past. There are a number of farmers who are now starting to do recording once they understand what they want to record. But we're also trying to engage with many public who have a passion for different wildlife, to use them if they've got a baseline understanding to come and do some recording on farms and connect and give us a baseline of where each farm is. And certainly that will help us understanding the habitat and the wildlife to deliver for future.
There's new biodiversity regulations coming into play in New Zealand, and that's going to result in some improvements in terms of some of that baselining, so that every farmer will need to essentially have a bit of a stock take of biodiversity on their property. So that's going to build up a really compelling picture and help with some of that other analysis as well.
I think the problem is, in the past, we've had lots of data about the productivity of the landscape, and we can share that, but we need to balance it off with the habitat and the environment. And many farmers are now starting to understand, by joining the two, it makes a more viable farming business.
Okay, thank you. Now, the next two questions are live ones. There's one from Rothio, and before that, I'm going to take a double-barreled question from Christian Christodoulou. So Christian, we're going to unmute you, and you can ask your question or your double question.
Christiane, I see that you're unmuted, but we can't hear you.
Okay, I presume you can hear me. Yeah, so firstly, I just want to say thank you. It was really nice to hear some positive stuff this evening. Yeah, two questions. The first one was to Martin. I was just curious about what the kind of membership was year on year, how it was going up with regards to numbers of farmers or amount of land, which is part of this kind of UK friendly farming for nature network. And the second question would be for anybody and everybody, and that would be, a lot of this seems to be kind of based on good faith and farmers' love of land. There's a kind of a real trend at the moment in conservation from lots of people wanting to see rewilding, often of kind of predator species or keystone species, which can really impact on land, and to what degree that might kind of make relationships with farmers quite tedious, not tedious, sorry, quite strained. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I'll start on the growth of the network. So when we started 2.5 years ago, the first 12 months were very challenging. Many of the traditional farming voices gave the network a lot of hard time, but the government gave us some opportunities and lots of organisations. So we're currently seeing probably a 10 to 20% a month increase, and particularly we're focusing a lot of energy around public as we go through a transition of farming systems and again, a public membership growth. But because we're free, many people support but don't bother signing up, but they're engaging in different ways. So we're actually, various sizes of farms from half a hectare up to 10,000 hectares and everything in between.
I can respond to the question about further wildlife and the idea of increased predator reintroduction. And that could be a whole session of its own, especially in this landscape, as there's a lot of talk about reintroducing the wolf to Colorado, which there's a lot of conflict around that with ranchers. There's also a lot of research that having those keystone species in a landscape actually is so much better for the full ecosystem. There's also debate in the conservation community on reintroducing or increasing predator existence in a landscape such as the venison sage grouse. They live on the ground, they can't fly very far, and so they're actually quite susceptible to predators. So there's there's some playing God, if you will, as you're thinking about these things. And I think as a land conservation organization, we try not to get into any of those kind of more detailed questions. We really focus on what we can provide as an organization. So what is our role in terms of conserving the land so that in the future it can be available for gunnison and sage grouse, for the wolf, for ranching, and let some of those other issues play out. And that gives us a really kind of a middle ground to stand in, and also gives us the ability to have relationships with all these varying parties across these issues.
From a New Zealand, sorry, Alana, sorry. From a New Zealand perspective, our predators are probably a little bit different. I've lived in Europe, where I understand farmers' concerns about wolves coming onto their property, etc. New Zealand's now set a vision of being predator-free by 2050. But when we talk about predators, it's largely introduced things like stoats and weasels, even possums that have sneaked over from Australia that we want to get rid of because they affect native flora and fauna.
And in the UK, there's a lot of talk about rewilding, particularly the less productive uplands and areas that are mainly livestock areas. I think for a lot of for the network and for many, it's how we have a wilder landscape and connecting in with farming and within that landscape. There's a role for livestock within these places, and have farming working in between having this wilder landscape in different places, and that connectivity of habitats across the whole landscape.
Okay, thank you. Now it's a turn for Rocio Lalanda. So we will unmute you. And while that's happening, I just want to mention that we're also getting contributions about people sending in website information and websites for farm and conservation networks in Wisconsin and Ireland. We will publish them. I think we'll try and publish them on the website of ILCN so that you can all see them, because I don't see any easy way to do it right now orally. But thank you anyway for those contributions. We'll make sure they get to everybody. Rafio, are you unmuted?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you. First of all, just thank you for the excellent presentations and the organization. It's attended many webinars, and this one's really clear. I really am enjoying it. I have two questions for Ilana. The first one, could you clarify the statement you made about the tax credit being transferable? And the second one, what study or studies did you base your findings, or not your findings, or your conclusions on farmers' motivations to conserve their land? Or maybe it was a combination of literature that's out there and maybe a study that your land trust did. So yeah, if you could clarify that, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure, thank you for the question. I see you're at Mount Grace in Massachusetts. That's wonderful. It's a great organization.
It is. Thank you.
So the tax credit is a state level credit, and the state recognized that a lot of land conservation, there was no benefit because the only incentive was a deduction, and only people with a lot of money benefit from federal tax deductions and tax credits. And so a lot of the farmers that we work with do not have big incomes, and the state recognized that, and the land trust community pushed to have the credit be transferable. The idea behind that is that the tax credit can be, so if I'm a landowner, I generate the tax credit through doing a conservation easement. I can't use it. I don't pay hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxes every year. So as a landowner, I can take that credit and I can sell it to someone else who pays Colorado taxes, and then they can use that tax credit. And how it usually works is it's on an open market. So there's about an 80 to 84 cents on the dollar. So as a landowner, if I have a $100,000 credit, I sell it for $84,000. Someone else pays $84,000 for it, and they get $100,000 worth of tax credit. So they're saving 20 to 16%, and the landowner's taking 20 to 16% off of the credit, but it's something that they can use the cash. They couldn't have used the credit. So in that case, it's transferable. So the credit can be sold to a third party.
And that's only done in Colorado?
There are about 6 or 7 states, I think, that have it. Virginia, New Mexico, Colorado, there's a few others.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah. And the second part of your question, kind of what findings do we have to talk about the landowner's motivation for conservation? We actually have not conducted a study. We just have a relationship with, now it's 200 different farmers and ranchers. And so just based on conversations with them is, and them telling us why they love it, why they love doing the program. A lot of them have come back to do conservation agreements on properties that they've bought with some of the funding from other conservation transactions. And so it's just more relationships and hearing landowners directly. So there's no formal study that we have on that.
Thank you.
Okay. Before I head to and there's now an anonymous question. If substantial hectares of land from dairy and beef cattle operations are retired from production due to changes in demand, including increases in the production of dairy and meat substitutes, can those hectares be productively pivoted for conservation purposes? So who of you would like to answer that one?
I'll kick in. Some of that land could be used. Some of that land could be changed into other uses. It could be used for bioenergy products. It could be used for multiple uses. Yeah.
I think the key there is if a beef producer or a farmer, isn't producing the livestock, they still need to get their money out of the property. And so and there has to be some payment, I think, then for the wildlife habitat work that they would be doing or setting it aside for wildlife. So there'd have to be a payment. If not, I think the threat is that the livestock industry goes away, and then you have these properties that landowners are stuck with. They're still paying taxes, they're maintaining them, and so they're more likely to then dissolve their operation and sell the properties into development. And so I think we have to think about what the market is and what the incentives are after that livestock or that beef production goes away.
Yeah, I'd add that we're not yet seeing the demand for some of those products decline from a New Zealand perspective. It's certainly recognised as a risk, and I think there's plenty of examples, certainly in New Zealand, where farmers have voluntarily retired land from production, set it aside for nature conservation, permanently in some cases, and then they've offered that back as a benefit for recreation or tourism, as well as the environment more generally.
Okay, thank you. Then we have two questions. One is an anonymous question, and the other is a live question by Brendan Dunford. So we will unmute you. The two questions are similar. The anonymous question asks, is there a need for farm conservation advisory services to work with and enable farmers to develop and realize conservation visions for the land? And who is best placed, if there is such a need, who is best placed in your country to deliver that? And who should fund such a service? That's the anonymous question. And we will now let Brendan ask his question because it's quite similar. Then the panel can answer two questions in one go.
Yeah, hi Anton. Hi guys, can you hear me?
Hi Brendan.
Thanks very much, and really good presentations. I'm very conscious of the fact that conservation has to pay, and I think you really addressed that, all three of you, in your presentations. And I also think you've addressed the issue around the enthusiasm of some farmers for conservation. But the missing piece I just wanted to ask you about was, where does a farmer go to get information on kind of how to farm for nature? So if he wants a particular species of tree or grassland that mix, where does he go? Who does he ask? Is there an advisory service to support this kind of innovation?
I can take a first go at that, kind of combining both of those questions. I think, at least in our state, there are a lot of resources for farmers and ranchers. There are, at the national level, there's the National Resource Conservation Services, and that's a very traditional farming federal agency that supports a lot of irrigation work, a lot of crop management, a lot of conservation initiatives on farm ground. And they have offices in every state. There are conservation districts, which is a little bit misnomer in terms of the use of that term. It's really a farming district, and there are services provided through those offices. In the United States, there are state land grant universities, and those are our traditional farming universities, and a lot of states, they have offices throughout the state that provide services to farmers. Traditionally, it was, how to increase your productivity, and agriculture really focused on the agricultural side of stuff. Though a lot of those entities are now shifting and providing a lot more information to farmers and ranchers on best management practices and conservation and habitat as part of the overall services that they provide. And so, and all three of those entities that I mentioned are very trusted by farmers. There are, depending on where you are in the United States, you have different political, backgrounds, and there's varying degrees of trust of the government or of, what's considered liberal NGOs. And so those don't always fit into the same areas, but those three entities are generally trusted across the board. So the university system, the federal farm agency, and then the local conservation districts. Okay, the next questions are
Let me see now. If those yes, Mr. Kyriakos Skordas. We're going to unmute you. You're going to go live, and after him, Angelo Salzi. So Kyriakos, it's the floor is yours as soon as you're unmuted.
Yes, hello to everybody. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. So my question is, if you think that we can increase the willingness to accept of users of farming ecosystems in actions for the improvement of wildlife habitats. And we all know, especially in Europe, that the CAP is a very strong framework, not only with the regulation, but also with the subsidized system. So can we create any roadmap of actions with no subsidize? Can we convince, can we engage our farmers to be more friendly to our wildlife?
Yeah. Well, James, that should be up your street. No subsidies.
Well, we would argue that you can, providing you find a market for your products. And I guess the point is we can't produce everything, so we need to find willing trading partners.
And from the UK side, I think we need some strong baseline standards. If we have a standard we must meet for managing the landscape, that becomes part of our business cost. And then, yeah, it's finding markets that we can get revenue from, either the service we provide or the product we produce. Because if we want to deliver something, then there needs to be market return for the business.
Yeah, I would say the same as Martin. The market for those products would be the most important part from our perspective.
Okay, the next question is for Angelo Salzi, who's also wanted to go live. So Angelo, we're going to unmute you.
Okay, here I am. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for the nice presentation. The first question is, would you like to be invited to my place? I'm cooking pizza, but I already know the reply.
Yes, we all would.
I'll be right over.
Question is, the second question is more is a bit more serious. It's I really wonder why in certain places in the world, like in the Benelux, where I currently live, and also Anton, or say in Iowa, with the usual exceptions, farmers and NGOs seem to live in almost in two different worlds and almost antithetic. Do you understand why this happens in certain places, and in other places, like the one you presented, it seems to be, I wouldn't say a totally different picture, but quite a different one?
Angelo, it sounds like you're really getting to the heart of kind of the title of this presentation, which was utter opposites, you know, conservation and farming. Is that right? You know, being really at odds with each other. And I think at least in the United States, a lot of the history of quote unquote conservation or the environmental movement has been really come from a very liberal, almost elitist, a wealthier perspective. A lot of the people that led those movements to begin with, you know, maybe they weren't farmers and ranchers themselves. And so it came from outside the kind of the farming and ranching world. And I think that, you know, for a long time was perceived as a threat to their livelihood, you know, trying to shut down farming because of a bird, or shut down logging because of the owl in the Northwest. So there's been, you know, traditionally it's come from a lot of that conflict. But I think over time, certain types of NGOs have recognized that that's not the most beneficial way to do business. You know, being at conflict with farmers and ranchers is not the way we're going to succeed. And if we want to work on properties that are, you know, are privately owned, we have to figure out where do we meet those farmers and ranchers, and where do we find common ground? And that's where we're going to get the most success. You know, where do we have shared interests?
Certainly from a New Zealand perspective, there's been growing concerns about an urban-rural divide. So in some respects, but the agricultural industry is trying to reinvent itself as food producers, because that's something we all cherish. And there's also hope that, I mean, in New Zealand, given that farming is our most important sector, and people have to appreciate that economically it's going to be even more important for us going forward with some of the impacts of COVID-19, that we can build up a new earned respect for each other.
And the UK, a lot of the NGOs have complained about farming practices in the past and declining in species or water quality, and put all farming in one pot. And we know there's many different sorts of farming, and we've seen a transition to many conservation organisations recognising what they would like to see as good, and recognising those farming systems to say, this is what we like and this is what we don't like, rather than putting all farming in a pot. So at least we can get some recognition of where do you want us to go as farmers from the conservation view, and then we can work out how we can fit that into our farming systems. And the last few years have become a lot better in combining the various organisations in finding just small bits of common ground to start those conversations.
Good, thank you. The next question is from Simone Tenorio. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Simone, we're going to unmute you so you can ask your question.
It's going to get some pizza.
And I think Simone might have signed off.
Okay, so, okay, then we go to the next one. There's another question from Albertine Paradox. Is she still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Good. Okay, go ahead, Albertine.
Well, I'm in the Benelux too, so I would like one of those pizzas, if you don't mind. Yeah, I have a question. I work for a local for a municipality, and in the area of agriculture. And I was wondering, from the three presenters, could you share your ideas on what a municipality could do with regards to conservation and agriculture?
I can dive in with, we actually have really close working relationships with a number of municipalities in the landscape that we work in. And we engage with them on a number of things. In a couple of cases, they actually fund some of the work. So they actually fund my position to do some of the work on fruit tree protection or fruit ground protection. So they help pay part of a salary at an NGO. And that can be a real boost to NGOs that have very small budgets. And it's a way for the government not to have to invest in a full-time employee. Instead, they help pay for some time. Other things that we've done, we'll write grants together. There may be expertise. There may be grants that, foundations are offering or government agencies are offering that can only go to a public entity like a local government. And so in those cases, we work with the public government to write grants to get money for conservation. And the other thing is, I think the public, the local governments oftentimes have connections with either making policies or encouraging policies at the local level that encourage conservation. So there might be, small things that stand in the way of conservation or best management practices. And if the local government can help remove some of those, that's great. Oftentimes also the people in local government have connections to higher up government, state or federal agencies, and they might have a little more pull in helping to incentivize conservation or remove barriers to conservation. And so the government can play a role, the local governments can play a role in that as well.
Thanks, Ilana.
Of course.
Okay. Then I think we've room for, two more questions. One's an anonymous one, and then we'll go to Marta, who wants, so we will unmute Marta. The anonymous question is one for Martin. It's about a bit more detail about the new policy in the UK after Brexit? In other words, the new public payments for public goods policy. What exactly does it mean for farmers, and how does it differ from the old common agriculture policy?
So the current policy we are under, we get an area-based payment per hectare that we can farm, and that is measured to the outside of the field. As we transition over the next 7 years, that payment is declining, and then in a few years, the new public good money will be available. But they've not given us the outline of what that funding will be. They've told us the pot size, but what target and what delivery farmers will need to do. But it's also complicated because we also have a different policy in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, as well as England. So we may be competing within the UK with a different farming support structure, market recognition structure, and other things. So it's lots going on, and many of them discussions, but it's about how we manage our landscape in a better way. If public, for me, if public are going to give me money, I want to be able to deliver something that the public wants me to deliver, but I also want them to recognise the produce I produce and recognise that in the supermarkets or in the restaurant chains, because that's what can drive me to change most, is having a viable business.
Okay, and now we turn to Marta. Your question?
Anton, I believe Marta has also signed off.
Okay, shall I just ask the question anyway? Yeah, we can do that. So Marta was asking, can you give recommendations on how to engage land owners to involve the land into conservation practices, and particularly differences in approaching large and small landowners?
So I'd say find ways of engaging with them and find out how and why they farm. Don't go in and tell them to farming in a different way, and then sort of join and find their passion and engage that and work on a roadmap or on a slow steps. Some farmers, big or small, will get there very quickly. Some will need a lot of support and a lot of encouragement to nudge them in a direction. But many farmers feel it's their farm, their landscape, they farm it. You need to go in and engage warmly with them to get them to move in a direction.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, you know best, you are the farmer. And I think building on that, one of the successes we had experience with in the landscape with the Gunnison sage grouse bird is we actually set up a whole kind of a resource library for landowners 25 years ago. One component of that was conservation, but we had resources for landowners to spend time with attorneys talking about their estate planning and how they managed their farm or ranch in terms of inheritance, taxes. We had landowner or resources set up to help landowners with getting feed for their cattle, getting water moved around the property to places that they needed it. So we actually set up a resource library, and the local government was involved with this as well. And then one of those tools was conservation that we provided as the NGO. But relationships developed with landowners through that process over many, many years. And some of the landowners that maybe we had just introduced some of these concepts with them 25, 30 years ago are now doing conservation work on their property. So I think a big part of it is also just being patient and letting those relationships develop over the long term. Don't have expectations that you can just step in and say, hey, I've got this great thing for you and next year we'll have it done.
It's our view that farmers learn best off each other. So one of the things we do is encourage some of our award-winning farmers to open their properties to other farmers so that they can go and have a poke around and see and observe and ask questions themselves.
Okay, thank you. You guys are really good at answering questions. We're still within our time, and I see there's another question. We can take one more question. It's a live one, so I think it'd be nice to do it. It's Joseph van der Stegen. Who has a question? We're going to unmute you, Joseph. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, good. Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hampton. Yes, I mean, maybe you have already answered the question, but my question was how to connect with the less sensitive farmers, the farmers who are the less sensitive to conservation. So how to build a bridge and to slowly start a relation with them.
Okay,
it's a combination of things. Martin, why don't you start? You've got more integrity because you're more likely to have some dirt under your fingernails than I do.
I think I see farmers in three pots. We have a third-ish, but they're not in numbers, of those who really care and passionate about the landscape. You have a third that are kind, interested and want to do something, and you have a lump of the industry that is very production-minded and harder to reach. And the only way to reach them is farmer to farmer. And why does it work for their farm, their business, their landscape? They have a different focus, and then they will start the journey. But once you switch them on and they connect with it, they may race to the very front because suddenly that's their passion and that's what's going to work. But it has got to be about farmer to farmer, opening farms up, getting farmers to see what their neighbours are doing and why, because they are the relationships that work for those tougher nuts that we all need to crack.
Okay. Anyone want to add to that? Okay. All right. Then we've reached the end of our slot, and so this is not the Football World Cup. There's no extra time, so we're going to. But first, a message for the Europeans in particular, but not exclusively, of course. The European Land Conservation Network, ELCN, which is co-financed by the European Union LIFE programme, with the objective to provide ideas and examples for future European policy, is reaching out to connect to existing national networks, such as the Farming for Nature in Ireland, and to the new European level results-based payment network. And results-based payment is about paying farmers for achieving conservation results, not for doing or not doing specific farming activities, which is now the case with the European agri-environment subsidies. So if you'd like to know more about that, here are the websites of the ELCN, and you can contact Tilman Disselhoff, the project coordinator of ELCN, and that's his email there. Or you can have a look at the results-based payment network, which is a new website, just up and running, but already quite a lot of interesting information. Now, to close, I would say that this webinar has been about farmers who care about nature. So let's help each other, because we all care about nature, all of you who are listening. So let's help each other. Every time you buy food, you're voting with your wallet or your bank card. Exercise the democratic right to support farmers who are supporting nature. So where you can, buy directly from those local farmers who work with environment and biodiversity in mind, at the farm gate or in a farm shop or whatever. In the supermarkets, look out for food produced by farmers who are committed to clean and green, to preserving environment and biodiversity and nature. I know it's not always easy in the supermarkets, but there are ways and means. So that's one practical follow-up to this webinar all of us can do, even during COVID lockdown. And before I sign off, I would like to thank Chandni and Robin for their meticulous work behind the scenes. Without them, this webinar would not have been possible at all. So thank you for joining us today, and stay safe and healthy.